Hello everyone and good afternoon. Welcome to Surviving Economic Abuses, Economic Abuse and Privately Owned Housing webinar. We are just waiting for a few more people to join and we will start very shortly. Thank you so much for joining us today and you'll be able to use the chat function throughout to ask any questions. Brilliant. So I can see the numbers rising of people joining. So welcome to everyone who's just joined. Welcome to Surviving Economic Abuses webinar today. Today we're going to be talking about economic abuse and privately owned housing. So a big welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time out today to join us. We've got a packed agenda, so I definitely will get started and just head through. Please feel free to use the chat function throughout. Where our training officer will be able to answer any questions you might have. And also please feel free to pop any questions for the panel that you might have today in the Q&A section. So just kicking off with a bit of an outline as to what we're going to cover today. So today's agenda, we're going to hear about the whole housing approach and the launch of the whole housing toolkit. And this toolkit was aimed to work in partnership, addressing the housing needs of all victim survivors. The toolkit's been really instrumental and we'll hear a lot more about that later on. We're also going to listen today about the survivor journey. So the journey that survivors take from when they might separate or leave a relationship, and then ongoing, how do they separate those and de-link those economic ties? We're also going to have the pleasure of hearing from a survivor of economic abuse and discussing the importance of the legal system and how that can act as a barrier for victim survivors. We're also going to look at the national picture. So surviving economic abuse works nationally, and we're going to have a look at the overall picture in the UK and look at some of the key issues which affect victim survivors in privately owned housing. And similarly, we're also going to focus on the local response. So at Surviving Economic Abuse, we have a housing advice service for professionals working with victim survivors of domestic abuse. And we will talk a little bit more about that today. So today we are going to hear from 3 different speakers, and including myself. So I'm Christina Govia, Head of Specialist Services at Surviving Economic Abuse. And today I will be speaking alongside Natalie Page, who's a survivor and campaigner from the Court Said campaign, Rebecca Varghese, Whole Housing Approach Programme Manager at Standing Together, and Stephanie Orr, who's our policy officer, who has a specific focus around housing and works for us at Surviving Economic Abuse. So today, we just really want to, at the start of this webinar, just make sure that everyone takes account of what we're talking about today. So we will be talking about abuse, which is obviously an emotive topic. So please do exercise self-care during today's session. If you need to leave the session, a recording will be available afterwards, so you won't miss out. Please feel able to seek support via the chat function, and you can message our moderator privately. So you can message C Training privately, and they'll be able to deal with any queries or concerns you might have. Just to let everyone know that we will be using real life examples today and case studies really to bring this issue to life, but also just being mindful that, you know, sometimes we might recognize our own experiences within that, and that can be particularly challenging if that brings up feelings. So just in case you need to, just familiarize yourself with the functions on the screen today. In your bottom right-hand corner, you have the leave function, should you need to leave the meeting. And just as a flag, we do have our website with nearly 30 resources for victim survivors available. So if you do need particular information on a particular issue, please do visit our website, and further signposting will be provided today in the chat function. So I really just wanted to start on, obviously today's webinar will focus on economic abuse and housing. And so I just wanted to introduce you briefly to surviving economic abuse and the work that we are doing. So our overall aim is that through working in partnership, we really would like women to be able to access their own economic resources, to be in control of these, to be economically stable, to be compensated for any harm that occurs as a result of economic abuse. And ultimately, what we want to see is that women and girls are economically equal in society. So how do we do this? In a number of ways. So we really focus on making change through educating. So we really work to raise awareness of economic abuse amongst professionals, amongst all forms of services. And that's really part of an increased understanding. We want society to better recognise economic abuse and therefore have better responses to it. We work really hard to improve professional practice, so working with professionals in various different systems and institutions in order to support them to recognise and respond to economic abuse appropriately. We work really hard to change policies and procedures, including getting economic abuse included in the Domestic Abuse Bill, which is currently journeying through Parliament. And we do this so that organisations can understand the issue and remove some of those barriers that act as a block to economic safety for victim survivors. And then last but not least, we aim to change national laws so that policymakers can really reflect that understanding of economic abuse, so that when they make decisions about commissioning, about different services, that economic abuse is at the forefront of their mind and that they're considering victim survivors of this particular form of abuse in any decision making. So just before we get into the real housing content today, I just really wanted to touch on economic abuse. And you probably heard the terms financial abuse and economic abuse used almost interchangeably. And previously, financial abuse was included in the policy definition for domestic abuse. But as I mentioned, economic abuse will be included in the new statutory definition of domestic abuse in the Domestic Abuse Bill. Once it finally passes. And why we prefer the term economic abuse is because it encapsulates a much broader range of behaviours. So when we talk about financial abuse, a lot of people jump to the conclusion that we're talking about just money, just finances, but actually economic abuse is much broader than that. So it refers to control and coercion that's outside of money and finances. So looking at other utilities, which is why we'll be talking today about housing, but also economic abuse can include things such as restricting access to food, transport, water, and any other utilities. So it's not that financial abuse doesn't exist, it absolutely does, but we see it as a subcategory of economic abuse, and economic abuse is that umbrella term. So as I mentioned, economic abuse is going to be defined in the bill, and on this slide you'll be able to see the definition. So economic abuse is defined as any behaviour that that has a substantial and adverse effect on B's ability to acquire, use or maintain other property, or to obtain goods and services. And so the definition also clarifies, so property would cover items such as a mobile phone or car, and goods and services would cover, for example, items like utilities or food and clothing. So what we see with this definition is it enables capturing a much broader range of behaviours which victim survivors are experiencing. And so what we know about economic abuse is that it drastically limits women's choices and ability to access safety. So economic abuse, as we just saw in an intimate partner relationship, often involves restriction, exploitation of economic resources, and also sabotage. And what we know that that leads to is increased economic instability for victim survivors. And when someone's economically unstable, there are huge barriers to them leaving in terms of the cost of leaving, but also other barriers. So by being, by experiencing economic abuse, victim survivors may experience increased physical harm due to not being able to leave. There's also the loss of potential for victim survivors who, as a result of the economic abuse, may be prevented from accessing credit to move forward, may be prevented from accessing future careers, for example, due to the impact of the economic abuse. So what we know is that the economic stability is vital for victim survivors in moving forward. So our first speaker today is going to be Steph, and Steph is our housing policy officer. And Steph's really going to set the scene for us today and introduce why it's so important that we consider the needs of victim survivors who own their own home. Steph is currently working as HATSE's housing policy officer, as I mentioned, and she leads surviving economic abuse's work as part of the whole housing approach and worked on that project last year as well. So I'll hand over to Steph now, who will introduce why we need to pay close attention to victim survivors who own their own home.
Thanks, Christina. Yeah, and thank you so much for everyone who's joined today. It's really important to talk about homeowners. And I know from my previous role as a frontline independent domestic violence advisor, that homeowners can often be forgotten, can often be invisible to services. And when frontline services often go to address housing needs, they can be really equipped to address the needs of those who are renting, but perhaps less so with homeowners. So we're going to talk through some of the major issues that homeowners face today. And weaving into that, we're going to also talk about some of the work in relation to policy and practice that we're doing at SEA. So first of all, why homeowners? Well, surprisingly to some, homeowners actually make up 63% of all households in the UK. So when we're thinking about survivors and meeting their needs and their housing needs, it's quite likely that the majority of them will live in privately owned housing. And according to the Crime Survey of England and Wales, in 2018, 47% of everyone who said they were experiencing domestic abuse in that year lived in privately owned housing. And I guess that's not really surprising because we know that domestic abuse, it doesn't discriminate by wealth or tenure or social status. So we know that people from all backgrounds are affected by domestic abuse. And so it's really important that if this is about half of everyone in the UK who's experiencing domestic abuse, then we really need to be well equipped to meet their needs and support them with their housing needs. And from speaking to survivors and doing this work at Surviving Economic Abuse, we created a subset of our Experts by Experience group. So the Expert by Experience group is a group of survivors who work along SEA to raise awareness and speak about their experiences and to create change. And so we have a small group of survivors who are homeowners. And from speaking to them and by carrying out other research, we realized that there were 3 key systems that economic abuse can take place specifically for homeowners. So we realized that it can take place when purchasing and selling the home, also within mortgage lending. So there are particular issues that come up with the mortgage as a product, and then also within the family law response. So there are 3 separate systems and arenas that we're going to speak about today. But also quite importantly, what women told us was that there seems to be this myth of a homeowner as someone who is perhaps middle class or wealthy, who isn't really seen as needing much help. And in fact, one survivor told us that they actually were turned away by 42 services who said that they couldn't help her. So something's clearly not quite right. Where often when we speak to frontline services, they say that a much smaller percentage of the survivors they support than the 47% actually makes it through to their caseloads. So something's happening here and we really need to take a look into what is happening. Now, I won't go into too much detail here because you're going to hear shortly from Rebecca, who will talk more about this. But SEA's housing work is part of a much wider programme of housing work that really aims to meet the needs of all survivors. So we focus on one of the 12 strands of the whole housing approach, and that's privately owned housing. And the reason that we lead on this part of the work within the project is because it really built on the work that we were already doing with mortgage lenders, with the banks at the time that the project was set up. And we'll talk more about the work shortly. And now just to give you an idea as well about the varied profiles of homeowners and survivors across the UK. you can't really pigeonhole survivors. There is no one size fits all idea of a homeowner. And when we look at the different project sites for the whole housing approach, it was piloted in 3 different geographical areas in the UK. So in the north, we have Stockton-on-Tees, where there's 69% home ownership, and the average house price is around £125,000. So this is much more affordable than, say, when we move to Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, where a similar percentage of homeowners live there, but the house price is raised to £260,000. And actually, when we look at Cambridge City specifically, the house prices rise even more. And then we move to an area with a very different profile, inner London. So Hammersmith and Fulham, Westminster and Kensington and Chelsea. And here we see that average house prices can be around £1 million. So the women, the survivors, the homeowners that we spoke to within the Whole Housing Approach project, they have a really varied income, social class and status, net worth, different amounts on their mortgages, but they're all really facing similar issues. And just to sort of summarise that, on average across the UK, 63% of households live in privately owned housing with house prices £244,000 on average. And just to let you know as well, there is a toolkit available for anyone who wants to look in depth at some of the work that we've done, who was working at a local level. So the Whole Housing Approach has a toolkit for all 12 strands. And at C, we've written 2 chapters of the toolkit. One that looks at economic abuse across all housing tenures. So for anyone who's interested in how economic abuse might play out across the rented sector, you can have a look there too for a bit more information. And there's also a specific toolkit chapter to summarise a lot of what we're going to speak about today. So please do take a look. It's available online at the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance's website.
Thank you, Steph. I think that's a really helpful snapshot just to start to understand the issue. I know when I first came to this issue, I wasn't aware of how many people really did live in privately owned accommodation. And I think it's really important that we establish that as the starting point today. So thank you. I'm now going to hand over to Rebecca. Rebecca is Programme Manager on the Whole Housing Approach at Standing Together. Thank you so much for joining us today, Rebecca. And Rebecca's really just going to situate where privately owned housing fits into the rest of the whole housing approach and give us a bit of the overall picture. Thanks, Rebecca.
Brilliant. Thank you, Christina. Hi, everybody. I'm Rebecca Baggy, and I'm the Whole Housing Programme Manager at Standing Together. We're a domestic abuse charity based in West London, and we deliver the coordinated community response to domestic abuse model, which involves working with organisations and professionals to think about domestic abuse differently and to think about how they respond to survivors and perpetrators that might be accessing their services. It's really wonderful to be here with you today, and it's great to see so many of you here. And thank you so much to Surviving Economic Abuse for inviting us. I'm going to share with you today a brief overview of the Whole Housing Approach project and a bit about the background, why we exist, why this project came into being, and to hopefully encourage you to think about how you might be able to do this in your local areas. So as you know, safe and stable housing is a core need for everybody, and this has particularly been pertinent in recognition of the lockdown situation that we've been in the past few months. This is more so the case for survivors of domestic abuse who are potentially trapped at home with a dangerous perpetrator during these times. Domestic abuse is often targeted towards survivors in their home. It's often the most dangerous place for them to be. And in the UK currently, we know that 3 women a week are killed by a current partner, an ex-partner, or by a family member. And just under 70% of these murders are committed inside the victim's own home. So when it comes to keeping safe, all too often the onus falls on survivors and their children to have to flee their homes for safety. And currently there's a huge over-reliance on refuges as being the main housing option when faced with having to flee. Refuges are already currently struggling to keep up with this demand, with 60% of referrals being turned away. And survivors, who are mainly women, must then bear the emotional, financial, and practical costs of having to start over again. And all too while, with the perpetrator often remaining in the property that the survivor had to flee from, consequence-free. So there's been some research to look at the needs, like how survivors are experiencing this in terms of what they need most. And what we're seeing in some of the research is that survivors are telling us that all too often, this is one of the greatest injustices that they're facing. And that for many, being able to be in a safe and a stable and affordable home is more important to them than seeking justice against the perpetrator through the criminal courts. So those involved, with that in mind, those involved in delivering housing, such as social housing providers, which often includes local authority housing services and housing associations. We have private landlords, and we have the sectors involved in private ownership, which Stephanie just introduced you to. They all have a key role to play in identifying and responding to domestic abuse. They're in a unique position to be able to access survivors, to be able to have conversations with them, and to be able to have ongoing contact. They're well placed to offer a helpful response when domestic abuse comes to their attention and when they spot the signs. Taking such action will help to create earlier identification, and it will help prevent situations from reaching a crisis point, and it will also save lives. And it will also potentially, like one of the big pieces of research that reveals is that survivors want to remain in their own homes. They want more options to be able to do that. They don't want to be the ones to have to flee and relocate. And so housing providers have a lot of power to be able to enable that to happen. Most of our attention to date, in terms of a response from housing to domestic abuse, most of our attention to date has focused on social housing settings. So that would be local authority council stock and housing associations. But as Stephanie mentioned, currently we have 17% of households who are living in England in a social housing tenancy. We then have 19% who are living in the private rented sector. And as Stephanie showed, there's 64% living in the privately owned housing sector. So the latter two, private rented and privately owned, make up 83% of households in England. And to date, not much has been done to really understand what's going on in those settings, the barriers that survivors are experiencing, and what they need to be able to have better options to be able to remain and retain those types of tenancies or tenure types. So with all of this in mind, we looked at what we needed to do to address the needs of survivors across all the tenure types, not just in social housing. And this led to the development of the whole housing approach. So my colleague, Goody Burnett, set up the National Domestic Abuse Housing Policy and Practice Group in 2017. Goody's also one of the co-founders for the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance, the DAHA project, which Standing Together are partners in delivering. And this forum brought together the main national services and charities that were operating in the housing and domestic abuse worlds. And they brought them together for the first time in one room to be able to talk about what survivors' experiences are across those tenure types. And this is where the whole housing approach was conceptualized. And essentially, it's a model that is for local areas to consider implementing as a partnership model that looks at how we can improve access across all of those tenure types. And then it considers what are the options, the initiatives, the interventions that we need in order to support survivors to access and maintain an existing accommodation or to access new accommodation if they need to flee for safety reasons. And we came up with these 12 components. And so what you see here in front of you, the top green, light green bubbles represent the different tenure types that survivors might be living in. And we need to look at each of those and think about what is going on there for survivors. What's happening, how do they get access to that, what happens to them when they're in that accommodation, and what happens if they need to flee. I'm not going to spend too much time going into that, and you'll hear more today from Stephanie about, in particular, the privately owned sector. But just to mention that at DAHA, the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance, we have a DAHA development manager that is particularly looking at what's going on in the private rented sector. And her name is Deidre Cartwright, and she works quite closely with Stephanie together to kind of look at understanding the experiences of survivors in those tenure types. Underneath, you see the darker green bubbles, or blue bubbles perhaps, and they represent the different types of initiatives, housing options that are needed in order to support survivors, to give them more options to remain in their housing or to relocate. And this is quite an early iteration of this model. This is a long-term piece of work that we anticipate will expand and continue to grow and add more options, particularly as we start to understand and know what survivors need in the private rented sector and privately owned, and do some more work with those key stakeholders to come up with the solutions. And I won't go through all of them, but I will draw your attention to the flexible funding bubble, because that has particular relevance to the economic situation that survivors find themselves in. And as was mentioned at the start, we know that perpetrators will proactively try to destabilize, sabotage survivors' economic situation as part of a means of controlling them. And this often restricts their ability to flee for safety. So this flexible funding pot is a pot of money that is literally there to support survivors across any tenure type to be able to access this in order to help them either gain a new housing or to stay in existing accommodation. So the main types of uptake for this is survivors accessing this through a domestic abuse service to help with paying off or clearing any debt that might have been caused by the perpetrator, which is known as coerced debt, which our sisters at Surviving Economic Abuse have done a brilliant job to raise our awareness about. This could also be about helping survivors who do need to flee to relocate to new housing. And it might be there as well. For many, it was about helping them create a house into a home. So many survivors needed household goods and items to actually be able to live in that property. And the survivors that we spoke to who used this fund had said that if they didn't have access to this, they would have not been able to relocate. They would have not been able to maintain housing. They would have been trapped with their perpetrator. So it's a very important option, and one that we hope that more and more we'll be seeing local areas starting to offer this flexible funding pot as a tool for domestic abuse services to be able to offer the survivors that they're working with to improve their housing outcomes. And then also just to mention, so we have a project delivery team that is delivering the whole housing approach across 3 different project sites, which Stephanie mentioned. And we're working in Stockton, in Cambridgeshire and London to deliver that with a range of different partners, including some specialist domestic abuse services, local authorities, and other charities to deliver the whole housing approach. And through the delivery of the project, we wrote the toolkit that Stephanie mentioned earlier. And that includes a chapter on each of those 12 bubbles. And we won't have time to go into it today, but I would strongly encourage you to go and have a look at our website. And I just noticed now in the chat that the link to that toolkit has been posted. So I'd strongly encourage you to go and have a look. And how it's designed is that you can dip into those chapters that you feel you'd like to develop further in your local area. And those that you have existing already, you might want to read that toolkit chapter to say, is it in line with what's identified as good practice? So I'd just like to end on an example. Stephanie, if you could please move to the next slide. So we supported many survivors to go through a whole housing approach in one of those pilot sites. And we spoke to 3 particular survivors in detail to get an understanding of what their journey was. So what was happening to them before, what happened during a whole housing intervention, and what happened after. In particular, what did we prevent from happening in terms of negative outcomes? And so I'm going to just walk you through very quickly Rashida's story, who's one, her name has been changed to protect her anonymity. And she's a survivor who was supported through one of the whole housing pilot sites. And she was living with her husband, who was quite violent and abusive towards her. She has 3 children. And at the time she was pregnant with a baby on the way. And she found that she had a local domestic abuse service. She contacted them and she was being supported by a mobile advocate whose main role is there to provide outreach support in relation to domestic abuse, but particularly focusing on trying to support survivors to get the best housing outcome possible. So Rashida was supported by a mobile advocate. Rashida then moved in with a family member, and that situation quickly broke down. So she made an application with the support from her mobile advocate to her local authority housing department. And that application was declined, unfortunately, because they felt that Rashida was applying in her local area and it wouldn't be safe for her to be there. But Rashida felt very strongly that she wanted her children to remain in the schools that they were going to. So the 3 children were going to 3 different schools. And she was concerned that if they relocated, there was a high risk that her children would disengage and there would be truancy. So the mobile advocate then looked at other options, and really Rashida's only other choice was to look at the private rented sector. She couldn't afford the rent deposit. So the mobile advocate supported her to access the flexible funding pot to secure that and pay for that, so she was able to move into that property. Her husband would continue to pursue her and abuse her and harass her. So the sanctuary scheme, which is a scheme to provide additional security measures to secure the perimeter of a home, to support, to help increase the security, but also to help survivors feel safer inside their own homes. So that was also provided as part of the whole housing approach. Rashida continued to access support from the mobile advocate, and to the point she felt that was no longer needed. And she felt, when we spoke to her at the end, she felt that had that support not been there in place, that she would have no doubt had to go back to her husband, who would have continued to abuse her, that would have escalated, and she would have potentially had come into contact with other services like children's services, that she would have been forced to have moved to a different local authority, make a homeless application, and her children would have not been able to continue going to a school which she wanted them to continue pursuing. So if you look at the bottom right screen, you have the green path, which represents the cost of a whole housing intervention. So the flexible funding funds, the cost of a mobile advocate, the cost of sanctuary scheme, that came to just under £2,000. And yet, if we looked at what the outcomes that were prevented in terms of a homeless application being made, further domestic abuse being perpetrated, and truancy issues, that comes to over £10,000. So what we're seeing here is that a small investment actually can make such a significant difference in the lives of survivors in terms of their safety and freedom, but it also has implications for saving money to the public purse. So I would encourage you, that's all I have for me, but I would encourage you to look at our toolkit, and we have 2 other survivor stories charted in this way. So you can have a look at the impact that the whole housing approach is having. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. It's great to hear, and I think you've definitely made the case on why we need to improve housing across all tenures. And following Rashida's story and just seeing the cost there and the difference that can make, and the difference emotionally that makes for the victim survivor as well, was just so great to hear. So thank you, Rebecca, for joining us today. We're now going to hear some more, some direct experiences from victim survivors. So we work at Surviving Economic Abuse alongside over 100 women who have lived experience of this particular type of abuse. And when we went out, we spoke to our experts by experience and asked them, if we were giving a webinar on privately owned housing, what would you like people to know about your experience? What were the challenges that you faced? And so we're just going to load a video up for you now where we can hear directly from victim survivors about their experience with privately owned housing.
My children only grew up with a mother constantly worried about the roof over their head. Your son calls you crying, there's 20 men outside the door and they're threatening to kick the door down. I arrived, the house was boarded up, there was all these men, I wasn't allowed in. After a few days we went to a holiday park, one of these lodges. We were in like a caravan park lodge. We had to
I
keep
think
on
we're
moving
having some problems with seeing the video. We can only see the file. Sorry, Steph. Just wondered if we'll just have another go and try again and see if we can get that video up and loaded. Brilliant, Steph, we can now see the video. So we'll just
grew up with a mother constantly worried about the roof over their head. Your son calls you crying, there's 20 men outside the door and they're threatening to kick the door down. I arrived, the house was boarded up, there was all these men, I wasn't allowed in. After a few days we went to a holiday park, one of these lodges. We were in like a caravan park lodge. We had to keep on moving constantly, every maybe 2-3 weeks. Sometimes we had to move to another one, carrying our belongings.
I've been on my knees several times debating, do I pay the mortgage or do I put food on the table?
We used the courts to run up huge bills to put me in difficulties, about £130,000.
Legally, there was nothing I could do. It felt like a really hopeless situation. It felt like I couldn't solve it. Nothing I could do would sort it out. I was totally powerless. The stress of managing that on a day-to-day basis was just awful. I didn't sleep. If I did, I'd wake up in the night panicking about it.
When your home is threatened, you are threatened. And it's really scary.
To sell a house takes time. You can't just up and go. There's preparing for sale, dealing with estate agents, and you don't know who to trust.
I'm now about to do my third move since I got divorced. It's affected my mental health tremendously. For the last 20 years, I've been in and out of depression and on antidepressants. It's affected my sleep.
Weirdly, if I didn't have a home and I was renting somewhere, I might have actually possibly got more support. It's like you're on a separate list of you are void from any kind of support because you have a home. It completely goes against you. It's like being blacklisted.
There isn't a blueprint either for what I went through. There is no, you can't see yourself in all the stories around abuse. So you stay because you can't see yourself in those stories. You think, well, I am a homeowner, I've got my name on this mortgage, I should be safe, and you're not safe.
Thank you so much. I think that video really encapsulates and is directly the voice of our experts by experience, of the women we work so closely alongside. So now Steph is going to, I'll hand back over to Steph shortly, who's going to start to take you through what we see as a typical survivor journey. So we're going to hear a bit more of the detail around some of the barriers and systems that prevent victim survivors from accessing safe accommodation and moving forward. For many survivors, the first step when they leave or are separating is to seek an emergency order. And there are some particular challenges around that for people who own their own home, and Steph will now share some more with you.
Thanks, Christina, and thank you for everyone with your patience with the video there. Always some technical difficulties. But I'm really glad that we do have that video, because it's really important to just hear about the difficulties and what it's actually like going through that for a survivor. And also to remember that this is on top of everything else that they're going through, you know, all of the abuse and the trauma, trying to rebuild their lives. They also have their home to deal with on top of all of that. And so, yeah, as Christina said, we're now going to have a little walk through some of the issues that survivors face. And these are very typical issues, although this particular journey is fictional, but it is made up of real life examples of what happens. So we're going to start with a typical survivor called B. And it's very common that if you are a homeowner and you live in privately owned housing, that the first step that you need to do is to find secure, safe accommodation. And now that's typical for any survivor, but it can be even more pertinent for homeowners. And this can be because the only option really for someone is to remove the abuser from the home. So often we can find, particularly where an abuser stops paying the mortgage, the survivor is faced with the decision. Do they stay in their home, try to keep the mortgage payments going on their own to try and stop repossession? Or do they leave, perhaps leave their job and go to a refuge and the home will be repossessed? So there's that decision there. And so many do try to go to the courts so that they can stay in their home and keep paying the mortgage. And now many of you may have heard of an occupation order. So this is a particular type of injunction that deals with occupation of a property, so where there are rights to occupy. And we've uncovered a few figures about occupation orders that leave a few question marks. So we've seen that actually from the period of 2003 to 2018, there's been a 77% reduction in applications for occupation orders. So what this means in terms of numbers is that in 2003, there were around 10,000 applications for these orders made in that year. And fast forward to 2018, and that number of applications is now only around 2,000. So there's been a big reduction in those applications, and it's unclear at the moment as to why that is. And then similarly, we've seen a reduction in the ratio of applications to orders made. So in 2003, of those 10,000 applications, that equated to about 9,000 orders being made, a ratio of 92%. Whereas in 2018, it was only a ratio of 48%. So of the applications for an occupation order that were made by survivors, just less than half of those actually resulted in an order. So, and we do hear anecdotally from survivors who say perhaps that they were told not to even bother to apply for an occupation order because the chance of getting it was quite low, or were told that, you know, if the perpetrator worked from home, that would really stand against them. And there seems to be quite a lot of anecdotal information as to why this might be happening, but at the moment it's really quite unclear. So we are supporting some research by the University of Northumbria's Law School. And so for anyone who is listening, who has personal experience of this, or who works with people with personal experience, we just want to let you know about this study that's taking place at the moment into occupation orders, and that's trying to unravel some of these questions and figure out what's going on. So Northumbria University are currently interviewing survivors who have experience with occupation orders. So if you do want to participate or share this information with people who might want to participate, please do so, because we're really hoping that once this study is completed, we'll have a better understanding of what is going on there. And we know that these orders are particularly important for homeowners. And so now when survivors do need to go to court for an emergency occupation order, or whatever the order may be, it could be child contact arrangements, it could be divorce, the first step can be to find legal representation. And many of you may be aware that some survivors aren't always entitled to legal aid due to the means test, and they then have to self-represent in court. And now this can mean that you have to essentially act as your own lawyer. You have to prepare all of your legal paperwork. You have to make sure it's all formatted correctly, filed on time. And you may even have to cross-examine your abuser in the courtroom. Now, as you can imagine, that can be a particularly traumatic and difficult experience for survivors. And when we hear from Natalie shortly, she will explain a bit more about what this process could be like. But now I just want to bring us back to our survivor B and think about her stage in the journey. So for B, let's imagine that she lives in London and has a joint property with her ex-partner. Now they bought this property a little while ago, back in 2003. And back then it was worth £150,000. So they got a mortgage for around that amount. Now, they live in an area of London where, since that time, property prices have increased a lot, and the valuation of her home is now £550,000. And let's say there is around £73,000 left on the mortgage, about half of it left. Now, we just want to do a poll. So, Becky, can we pull the first poll up, please? Taking that information into account, would you mind answering the poll and just indicating whether you think that, yes, B should be entitled to legal aid, whether you think no, she won't be able to access it, or you think yes, she will be able to access it, but perhaps with some restrictions on the amount. Brilliant, I can see the results coming in. Okay, so at the moment, the majority of people think perhaps not, around 60% think no. Numbers are changing slightly. Okay, so at the end of the poll now, it looks like we have 10% of people saying yes, they think she will be entitled to legal aid, 60% think not, and 30% think yes, she'll be entitled, but it will be restricted. Okay. Brilliant. So I think you should be able to see the results there. Now, if we just move on, I'll just take you through just to give a bit of a better understanding of what that might actually mean. So, should the legal aid receive an application from B, what they will do is they will do a calculation. Now, the first stage of this calculation, it makes sense. So they start off with the value of your home, and they imagine that if you sold your home, what money might you have at the end of that process? So they say, okay, well, we know that about 3% will go on legal fees, so that will go. And they acknowledge that, you do have some money left on the mortgage. So in B's case, this is £73,000. So they deduct those values, and then they come up with what they see as the equity. And now in B's case, B is a joint owner. So they acknowledge that, well, only about half of that equity will ever get to her. So in this scenario, they see that B has about £230,000 of equity. Now, then we move on to the next step. And there are then some further deductions. So there's something called an equity disregard. Now, this is where the legal aid agency don't expect people to lose all of their equity. When they apply for legal aid, you're allowed to keep up to £100,000 of that. And also, if you're in legal proceedings where the property is the subject matter of the proceedings, and we can assume that in B's case, this might eventually be the case, you know, she might be dealing with the property in the family court, you're allowed to deduct another £100,000. And then whatever value is left at the end of this sum is what the legal aid agency consider to be your capital. So in B's case, they consider her to have around £30,000 in capital. Now, if that number is greater than £8,000, you will be excluded from legal aid. So in B's case, she will not be eligible for legal aid. So that's the answer to the poll. The answer is no. Now, this may seem relatively fair, particularly if your home value is quite high, but we'll talk shortly about some issues here and perhaps some assumptions that underpin this calculation. And I also just want to mention that the maximum that can be deducted for your mortgage is £100,000. So if you have £200,000 left on the mortgage, this won't be taken into account. Now, I just want to quickly show an example as well, because where you're a sole owner, you can have a property worth much less than that and still be excluded from legal aid. So this is an example of someone who is a sole owner of their home. It's worth much less at £180,000. But at the end of that calculation, they still are seen to have greater than £8,000 in capital. So similarly, they would be excluded from legal aid. So it's not just those with much higher values of property that will be excluded. And this calculation, although it does take into account the fact that those who are wealthier should really be paying for their own legal advice, it makes an assumption that that capital is accessible to survivors. And as we'll speak about shortly, that really isn't the case all the time. But I just want to leave you, particularly anyone who works directly with survivors, with this message now, that home ownership does not always disqualify survivors from access to legal aid. Many can access legal aid, so it's really important to get them to speak to a law firm to complete a full legal aid assessment. But I also just wanted to flag, for those who may not know, that legal aid can be treated as a loan. So if you own a property, it can be secured against your property as a loan, and when you sell your home, the legal aid agency will then take the money back. Or if you are, for example, going to reach a financial settlement through the proceedings, the legal aid loan can then be recovered from a financial settlement. So a survivor may think that they're getting a sizable financial settlement, for then a lot of it to be taken in the legal aid fees. So it's just important to bear in mind. Now, to have a look a bit more deeply into these issues with legal aid, back in May, we conducted a survey and we shared it with the Experts by Experience group. And this was about access to legal aid. Now, 43 women responded to this survey, and of those 43 women, only 24 applied for legal aid. And now these women told us that they didn't bother applying for a variety of reasons. And for many of them, they were told that, you know, there's no point, you're a homeowner, or whatever reason it might be, just don't bother applying. And of those who did apply, only 8 were actually successfully granted legal aid. So this is 8 out of 43 women. And we can see from the graph here that the most common proceedings that these women needed support with were divorce and financial arrangements, followed by Children Act orders, so things like child contact. And we asked the survivors for the reason why they weren't eligible for legal aid on grounds of capital. So capital, things such as property and savings, anything that might be seen as an asset. So the most common response was jointly owned property, followed by property only owned solely by you. So we can see that there's a big link here between home ownership and being declined legal aid. And now we also asked how people funded their legal proceedings. And we found, you may not be able to see all of the items on the graph because there are quite a lot of options. But in summary, we found that survivors used a multitude of options that often resulted in debt. So many used a combination of taking out credit cards, loans, overdraft, borrowing from friends and family. And I think most alarmingly, 18 of the respondents said that they made serious cutbacks that affected their ability to pay for the basics, such as food. And now when we go back to this survivor who technically has a property in their name worth, £500,000, let's say, the reality might be that these survivors can barely afford food. So we really need to be aware and mindful of the fact that assets can be held on paper, but where economic abuse is taking place, these can be restricted to the point that survivors are actually living in poverty. Now, some of you may have seen that last week there was a ruling from the High Court about a judicial review in relation to legal aid. So this judicial review was brought by a survivor who was declined legal aid for child contact matters. And she jointly owned a property that was worth £650,000. And the legal aid initially, as you might expect, declined her application. The legal aid agency did. So she appealed that, and eventually a judicial review was brought by the Public Law Project. Now at C, we supported this judicial review by providing a witness statement. And I've just included a quote from the Guardian article about this particular ruling. Now, the judge ruled in the survivor's favour that she should be able to access legal aid. And the article said, the domestic abuse ruling by Mr. Justice Pepperell concluded that single parent and domestic abuse survivor who only had £28 in the bank should not have been refused legal aid for a child custody case. And of course, when it's put in those really simple terms, that's so obvious as to why a survivor should not be declined legal aid. You know, just because technically their name is on a property, if they can't access that and they need support in court for something so important as child custody, they really should be able to access legal aid. So we're really delighted with this ruling, and we're hoping that this will really create change moving forward. And we'll be watching this work very keenly. So just to let you know, there is wider work that we're doing in relation to legal aid. So a few months ago, the Justice Select Committee held an inquiry into the future of legal aid, and we responded to that consultation at C. And there's also currently a review into the means test that we'll be watching very closely. And I just sort of wanted to highlight that for us, it's really important to think about the further implications of when, you know, if survivors are borrowing and getting into a lot of debt just to fund their legal battles, even if they can access loans and credit, this is really going to undermine their economic security moving forwards. And that is in turn going to affect their physical safety too. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the next stage that could be in a survivor's journey. So at this point, we can imagine that B, we know she's not eligible for legal aid, but let's assume that she did get an occupation order after representing herself. So she's living in the family home, she's continuing to work, and she's trying to maintain the mortgage by herself. And now she's about to face a stumbling block that's really common and that many survivors face. So what can happen is that abusers can stop contributing to a mortgage. And this is really common, even where it is not in their best financial interests. So even where, you know, their name is on the mortgage, and if the property is repossessed, that's going to hugely affect their credit. Some of their assets may be taken to cover any shortfall, and that's going to be on their credit report for a long time in the future. But perpetrators do this just to sabotage the survivor's home, even to their own detriment. So in this example, B is, say, paying what might be a typical monthly mortgage payment for a mortgage of her size, which is around £700 per month. And she's just about making ends meet, doing that on her own without any contributions from the abuser. Now, what's very common when you have a mortgage is that you may have taken out a mortgage with a particular interest rate for a fixed amount of time, so often a couple of years. And then when that interest rate comes to an end of the fixed term, it will go up to what's called the standard variable rate. And this usually means an increase of about 3% in interest. And so what people usually do at that time is they will switch to a cheaper deal. They might even change mortgage providers just so that they can keep those monthly repayments at the same rate and so that they're not paying unnecessary amounts of interest to the mortgage lender. So let's imagine in this situation that B's interest rate has come to the end of the fixed term period. It's gone up by 3%. And for her, this means that her monthly payments have gone up by £215 a month. And that is purely on interest paid to the bank. And now this is completely unaffordable. She's going to start to move into arrears because she literally can't make ends meet now. So I'm going to ask Becky to launch the next poll. And just to get a feel of what you understand and what you think the bank may do. So in this case, it's clearly in everyone's best interest for the bank to allow her to renegotiate the interest rate. You know, it's not in the perpetrator's best interest to be paying for, you know, £200 unnecessary interest as well. So what do we think the bank will do? Do you think they'll allow B to switch without his consent? Yes, no, or perhaps on a case-by-case basis. Okay, I can see the answers coming in. Thank you everyone for your responses. Okay, so at the moment, case-by-case basis seems to be in the lead, around 50% of you think that. Around 40% think no, and 10% think yes. Okay, brilliant. I think that's enough answers. If we could end the polling, Becky, thank you. Okay, so yeah, absolutely. It's on a case-by-case basis. So we've seen examples where the lender say yes. We've seen examples where the lender say no. And we've seen examples where initially they said no, but then they have done it. And it brings us into this grey area, which is really difficult, because when you have a contract, you know, as the lender, they have taken out a contract with certain terms and conditions with their customers, and the perpetrator is one of their customers. And so if they were to change the terms of the mortgage without their consent, there's a really difficulty with the legalities of that. But at the same time, it's a really obvious example of sabotage, where it's quite clear that the perpetrator is deliberately running up the monthly mortgage payments just to sabotage the payments. And of course, if that goes far enough, that can lead to arrears and repossession, which isn't in the customer's best interest, excuse me. So this is an area of work that's ongoing. The practice isn't particularly consistent, and the financial sector are really in the process of figuring out what to do in these situations. Thank you, Becky. Okay, and it's a really difficult situation to be in. And there's some research that see alongside the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance commissioned from the University of Bristol. So we asked them to have a look into a research project that they did a few years ago, but to analyse it with a housing lens. And when the researchers went back to look at the research, they found that most of the survivors they spoke to were either homeowners or privately renting. And they found that the crux of the issues really were because as soon as you have a joint tenancy or a joint mortgage, the survivor and the perpetrator are treated as a single legal entity. And this is really the source of a lot of the difficulties that survivors face. Because of course, you know, as soon as there is coercive control and you have a perpetrator of abuse, what if they're treated as the same legal entity as the survivor? If they don't agree with anything the survivor wants to do and they say no, they can block any attempts the survivor makes to try and increase their own economic safety, excuse me. So for example, if the survivor wanted to negotiate a cheaper interest rate or switch to an interest-only mortgage, or perhaps ask for a mortgage payment holiday just to try and keep on top of the mortgage, typically, if the abuser says no, they're not able to do that, which is a really difficult aspect of dealing with privately owned housing. And so whether as a mortgage in joint names, it's exceptionally hard to change conditions or get out of it if the abuser isn't consenting. So we have done some policy work in this area. And this started a few years ago with the financial sector, with the banks and the building societies, who are the major mortgage lenders in the UK. And that was the development of the Financial Abuse Code of Practice alongside UK Finance and alongside some other organisations. So if anyone isn't aware of this, this is an outline. It's a code of practice, it's voluntary, but all of the major lenders in the UK have signed up to this, all of the major banks and building societies. So it really outlines what a survivor can expect when they're speaking to their bank. So it might not be that they can do everything that the survivor wants. For example, they might not be able to simply remove the abuser from the mortgage, but there are things that the lenders can do. And there's a certain level of support that survivors can expect. So we work quite closely with Lloyds Banking Group, who are working in all areas of financial products to try and address and best support survivors. And for example, we know that they have a specialist support team for people who are experiencing economic abuse. And many of the major banks and building societies have similar services. So I really would encourage you to take a look at that, particularly if you're working with a survivor who's having difficulty with their bank or building society. And I also just wanted to mention that quite a focus of our policy work at the moment is on mortgage affordability regulations. These were strengthened in 2014, really as a result of the 2008 financial crisis, to try and make sure that mortgage lending was more responsible. Now, that's really good in many ways, but it can also mean that for a survivor, if they are trying to remove an abuser from a mortgage, they can be told, you know, with these increased regulations that are more strict, they simply can't remove the abuser because it would be deemed unaffordable. And now for some survivors, they may have been paying the mortgage on their own for many years, with the abuser present on the mortgage actively undermining that. So removing the abuser from the mortgage to them would actually make the mortgage more affordable. But unfortunately, these regulations can be a barrier to that. So that's an area of focus of ours at the moment. And if anyone's interested or wants to hear more about that or discuss it a bit more, please do get in contact. Okay, now, so the third stage in our journey, and this is where we're shortly going to hear from our survivor as well. So B now, if we think back at her journey, she's managed to secure the property. She wasn't eligible for legal aid, but she's managed to get an occupation order to remain in the home. She's trying to keep on top of the mortgage. She's slowly falling into arrears because she can't now afford the mortgage because the perpetrator is undermining that, and she's paying these very high interest payments. So she's really trying to deal with it and separate from the abuser. And she's now found that she's had to turn to the family court, because where there is a legal contract, it's only really the courts that can supersede that contract and can protect B at this stage. So let's say, for example, that B is a litigant in person because she's not able to access legal aid, and she's now been in the court for 2 years, just trying to deal with the property, get the divorce through and separate everything so that she's no longer linked to the perpetrator through this home. As we know, she's been struggling to pay the mortgage, and at this stage, let's imagine that the bank are threatening repossession. So B has now, after 2 years, successfully gotten a financial order. So after all that work in court representing herself, she's been able to get an order saying that the house must be sold. And, you know, the end is almost in sight for her. She's hoping that it will be over soon and she'll be able to hold on to her home. However, the perpetrator is not complying with the court order, and they are not, they're not complying, and they're not going along with the process of selling the home. So now I just want us to have a little think about the power of these orders, what can and can't happen, and what will happen next. So Becky, can you launch the final poll, please? So if you're able to, can you please just respond and answer, do you think that the court, do you think that B will be able to sell the home anyway, because she has this court order that her and the perpetrator and a judge have all agreed to? Will that be all she needs and she can sell the home? Or do we think perhaps she might need to go back to court again? Okay, brilliant. I can see the answers coming in. Thank you. So at the moment, around 80% think she might have to return to court. 22% at the moment think that she should be okay. She has this agreement, this court order. This should be all she needs. Hopefully she can just sell the home. Okay, thank you, Becky. Can we end the polling? Okay, so yes, absolutely. 78% of you are correct. Unfortunately, B will need to go back to court. So even though there is an order, and on this order, it will tell the perpetrator that if he breaches it, he may find himself in contempt of court. There may be all sorts of penalties. Unfortunately, the third-party organisations, such as estate agents, such as the mortgage lender, they are not bound by this court order. So as far as they're concerned, if their customer isn't agreeing to it, they won't continue with that, and they won't allow the process of the sale. And now this is a really great moment where we get to hear from a survivor. So Natalie, if you're able to unmute yourself, and Natalie's going to be able to tell us about what it's like for survivors at this point when they're going through this process and when they might end up back in court again. So thank you so much, Natalie.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. I hope you can all hear me okay. So I'm just going to introduce myself. I'm Natalie Page. I'm founder of #TheCourtSays, which is the campaign for survivor family justice. I'm also founder of RCIC, Survivor Family Network. I'm author of the Court Confidence course. I'm a campaigner, tutor and speaker. So leaving domestic abuse can be, as you've heard, an immense, quite intense journey. I'm going to take you through some of that journey. People at the beginning of that journey for survivors, and I certainly remember this, as well, people will tell you to just leave, like it's something simple. We know that a victim will usually endure many incidents before they actually leave. We know that victims may not leave on the first attempt. We know that resources are an issue blocking some people leaving. And I know the first thing that I said to someone who was trying to get me out was that I couldn't do it because he had control of the money, and where would we go? The focus on getting you out, and once you've got out, that's it, you've done it. That's the hardest part over, right? That's kind of what you're thinking, and that's what people are telling you at the time. And it's completely wrong. You've left the war zone, but now you are at the gates of something else, which we'll call the minefield. And this just leaving is really the beginning of the journey. One of the first mines in this minefield is housing, as you've heard an awful lot about here today. You may have seen or heard or directly experienced one of various scenarios with housing, and this is one of the first mechanics of the breakup. You may have left the property, but you might own it or have rights to it. It's just not safe for you to be there. You might have to turn to the court for protection. You may be in the property, but unable to afford it on your own. You may want to be in the same house, but he won't leave. You may go for an occupation order. You will usually be told that you can also just get an occupation order, or you may even be told he's got as much right as you to live there. And the occupation order may not happen. Because you have rights to a property, whether you're in the property or not, it may mean that you can't get legal aid. You may be in refuge if you were lucky to find a place. It also means that you might be listed as intentionally homeless. Now, who intends to be homeless really? It's not something that we aspire to. The leading cause of homelessness in women is fleeing domestic abuse, and we never intended to be victims. When I left, I did get legal aid, but that was a decade ago, and it didn't last long. Soon after, sweeping austerity cuts have meant that legal aid is not as routinely given anymore. This is one of the mines in this minefield, because without legal help, telling victims to just leave does not equip a victim to leave. We need equipment to see it through safely, and legal aid is crucial equipment. Legal aid and realistic advice that actually reflects the reality of just leaving when you are financially and otherwise tied to an abuser, because this is just the beginning. Another mine in the minefield is the child arrangements. Survivors report to me daily that leaving domestic abuse is like going from the frying pan into the fire, especially if you have children, because the children are right in the middle of this. The perpetrator will often file at court, and you'll now be at the beginning of a child arrangements case on top of all the other issues with housing and finances. You'll now more than likely be very familiar with the thud of those court papers and bundles as they land on your doormat. Abusers tend to love a child arrangements case because it provides them with endless opportunities to have the court working for them to punish you. It increases their control level exponentially, and the abuse dynamic completely changes. He's not abusing you at home anymore because the parameters have changed and you're no longer there. But the patterns of abuse and control do not disappear, and they are not cured by your separation. The patterns stay the same, and they are instantly recognizable as such by victims. But he will be doing it all within the processes and procedures surrounding the court or other systems. So in other words, he can now do it legally with the help of the state. The injustice in the family court is wide-ranging, and most of which has been confirmed in the government's own harm report. The shock report confirms that the system is biased against women, contrary to popular belief. Women suffer and children suffer. The harm report is 216 pages of the misery that has been going on in those rooms in recent years, especially. It details the many ways in which sexism, racism, classism, and some rather odd ideas about victims all intersect and collide to result in a train wreck that is the family court. And there's layers upon layers of it. They've admitted it, and change can't come quick enough. However, right now, it is still business as usual in the family court, and nothing much is changing just yet for families entering the system. One of those layers of injustice that is particularly unjust is the economic abuse paradox. Economic abuse is a crime. It is also one of the more prevalent patterns that I see in almost every single domestic abuse case involving children. There will be the coercive use of the victim's access to resources. It is also one of the remaining tools the perpetrator has after a victim leaves, apart from the children, that can be used as leverage, so they will most often use it. Child maintenance can be used as a vehicle to abuse, either withholding it completely to compound poverty or using child support as a means to leverage for other things and abuse further. They may empty bank accounts. They may prevent property from selling. They may report or try to interfere with you getting benefits. You may be going to food banks to feed the children whilst they are sitting on your money or your ability to access it. They may suddenly go self-employed or quit their job entirely to avoid supporting the children, and the children suffer. Feeding and clothing your children is the most basic of parental responsibilities. If you, with care of the children, just stopped buying things for the kids as they grew, you can bet that it would only be a matter of time before a social worker knocked at your door and words like neglect would be used. But an abuser can do quite literally just that. Yet money is a dirty word in family court. And this is the paradox, because you can't bring up this crime of economic abuse in a court of law. So if you can't bring it up in a court of law, when can you? If you bring up that he hasn't paid child maintenance or that he's emptied your bank accounts, it's very much frowned upon in a child arrangements case because it is seen as a separate issue. More darkly, there are some unwritten and quite disgraceful connotations about women and gold digging. It's not seen as child focused to bring up the issue of money or child maintenance. Yet we can't bring up children on fresh air. Let's be realistic. Non-abusing parents will completely understand the responsibility to parent, to nurture and support their children well enough in all kinds of ways, practical and otherwise. But abusers get away with doing the exact opposite and will also do it whilst playing the part of the non-abusing father rather convincingly to the court, because the court doesn't even want to know if he has done the most basic thing of all, which is contribute to the children's upbringing. In family court, economic abuse should be treated with more weight than it is. There is a lack of evidence often with domestic abuse cases, but with economic abuse, the evidence is often there. Finances have footprints. Economic abuse exists in almost every single domestic abuse case I have ever come across, and it was certainly true of my own experience too. It is a pattern that belies the truth. Often it is the key for a case if they would only look, because the abuser's narrative in the courtroom is not usually well reflected on paper. And if they looked, they would see a disparity, because we all know what it means. We all know what it means when we apply for child maintenance and then about a week later, that thud on the doorstep happens again. He's going for more contact and those court papers have just dropped through your door. Here we go again. We know what it means when a domestic abuser suddenly goes self-employed. It means that he is going to withhold child maintenance and get away with it, with a toothless CMS system and a civil system that puts their hands over their ears when they hear it. He's going to be high and dry. We know what it means when only one card on the joint account is used pretty much only in the supermarket. In an abuse case, that usually means the victim was only allowed authorised trips for supplies, evidence that usually belies a wider pattern of coercive control. If someone is only allowed authorised trips, how much control would that person have to be under? And who is perpetrating that? We know what it means when an abusing parent talks about children in percentages in court and makes demands using ratios. He'll demand his rights are served, and the children's access will be described as a ratio, a sum, or a percentage. It usually means that he's made a financial decision about his access and what that access means for him and his ability to punish you further. We rarely hear victims talk in the same way. Children are people and not percentages, and not property to be carved up like assets in divorce. Children suffer. A lesson for judges here is that the most common reason he's talking about rights, ratios, and percentages are not so much about the children's wishes and feelings. It's because he knows that the CMS make reductions for increasing contact. So the abuser's primary goal is to reduce his financial burden by increasing contact, whether the children welcome that or not. It's not about them. And he'll be talking in those terms because in his mind, pursuing shared care, that golden 50-50 ratio, is often a decision that allows them to continue abusing long after you've left. He's leaking clues everywhere that should raise doubt about his motives, and they're not usually in the best interest of the children, but the abuser. The family court journey is a difficult road to walk. The Court Confidence course in the last 6 months has helped hundreds of families through the system to a safer outcome. So if you are in family court at the moment in England and Wales for child arrangements, or you're at risk of being, pop along and have a look at www.courtconfidence.com. Child arrangements cases can rumble on for quite some time. Some take up to 2 years to get a final order. The journey for the victim and the children during this case is a really difficult one. The trauma of all the abuse is raked over, contested, counter-alleged, cross-examined. Continuing abuse happens routinely post-separation, and the family court provides ample opportunity. Continuing litigation and all that comes with that, you can have more than one case going on at a time even. There could be criminal and all sorts of other proceedings going alongside this child arrangements case or on the back burner whilst the children's case is underway. Abusers often try and make good on the threats that they made to you during the relationship, that they will remove the children and prove you to be an unfit parent or an alienator and take the children or ruin you in other ways. And children are supposed to be the focus, but they are ignored if they are not enthusiastic about contact with someone who has harmed them or their family. Abuse is minimised, ignored completely, or leaving families at unmanageable levels of risk, trying to co-parent with an abuser and fearing repercussions from the court when something goes wrong, because it removes the victim's agency in being able to address things. Meanwhile, the financials, if you're getting divorced, because they are separate, are yet to be discussed. You maybe haven't even started that case yet because they do the child arrangements first. So you could be 2 years deep into family court with ever mounting pressure surrounding debt or being financially tied that increases over time. But because you are stuck in a child arrangements case, this won't be dealt with quickly. The abuser makes that pressure more pertinent by exacerbating it and removing your ability to deal with it or removing your means to deal with it. So once you have got through the child arrangements, which by the way is such a subject in itself that you deserve a medal already because you've already completed a marathon if you've got through that, you are then propelled into the financials and the abuser has a new playground. By this time, you are emotionally, financially, and physically exhausted. Your legal aid may well have run out. You have neither the means nor the stomach for the financials, but the bell is already ringing for round 2. So on you go. Now, I fully understand here my words here are sounding like an onslaught. For a victim, that is precisely what this process becomes. A veritable onslaught that can continue for years on end. In all of this, the most important aspect is lost completely, which is the impact of all of this upon children. My abuser was allowed to keep me in almost continuous litigation for 9 years, either by taking me to court or engineering situations of his own doing that meant I had no other option to go back for some kind of legal remedy. An abuser is able to impact their victims for decades because the systems that deal with it allow that to happen. It's one hell of a ride. And we tell victims to just leave. It's time we rephrase that. And it's time we moved the mountains that need moving to rephrase that. Just leave is not reflective of the reality of it, the magnitude of the experience and the wider impacts. We need to be urging victims to leave. Of course, we need to be. But the conversation must shift from just leave to here's the equipment to help you leave safely.
Natalie, thank you so much for that. And what a perfect ending, absolutely. Here's the equipment, all these economic resources that people need, those tangible things that they need to be able to separate are so crucial. And I'm also reminded of a conversation that we had not long ago, Natalie, and you mentioned about how after, dealing with 2 years of court, when it came to the financials and you had all that paperwork, seeing the numbers on the page, as a very capable professional woman, dealing with that, with the stress and the trauma of everything that had happened, just how impossible that was and how that is a reality for so many people. And yeah, thank you so much. And just for everyone to know, Natalie is staying for the Q&A. So if you do have any questions for her, please do pop them in the Q&A box. And Natalie, do have a look at the chat because the feedback from everyone is absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay, so back to the presentation. And also, yeah, Natalie, I will come back to a point you made as well about the economic abuse paradox, because that is a really poignant and crucial part of these financial proceedings that we hear about all the time. And really, it's a very difficult situation that survivors find themselves in. And these proceedings are so difficult, particularly if you're a litigant in person, that one thing that we've found is that survivors are actually being advised to just allow their home to be repossessed as the easiest way to de-link from the perpetrator. That's how difficult this is, and just how few rights they have in the process and few avenues available. So this is a quote from Hansard. This was a discussion that took place in Parliament. An MP called Melanie On was speaking about one of her constituents, who's actually an expert by experience, who works alongside C. And Alex Cunningham MP responded, saying that Melanie had spoke of the coercive financial control that had left her constituent with huge debts, and yet that constituent was told that she should just default on her mortgage payments and lose her home, and then she might escape. That is not good enough. And that's absolutely true. And unfortunately, we do hear survivors being advised to do that and deal with the economic fallout with their credit rating afterwards, as that will actually be the preferable and easiest option. And I think that really helps as well to really summarize and show just how difficult this process is. But yeah, back to the economic abuse paradox that Natalie mentioned. So some people may be aware or may not be aware that when we're looking at financial proceedings in court, and it will be financial proceedings that the survivor will have to go through when they're trying to de-link their property, conduct or behaviour or abuse is only considered in extreme cases. So most economic abuse currently is likely to not be considered as relevant to the proceedings. So this is what Natalie was talking about before, about the fact that economic abuse, all of a sudden, it isn't seen as relevant. You're not allowed to talk about that. And many survivors find that that is their experience. We've also found a few key areas that survivors face when dealing with financial proceedings. So there are issues with the disclosure or non-disclosure of assets by the perpetrator, and also with, trying to freeze those assets before the perpetrator just simply gets rid of them. There's also an issue with the enforcement of orders. So as we said in B's case before, in this example, she's back in court because the perpetrator is breaching the order. So in this scenario, she would need to ask for the order to be enforced. Now, again, she'll need to know how to do that, to do it by herself, because she can't get legal aid, these very complicated procedures. And there's a good chance that when she does get to court and when she asks the judge to enforce a penalty for the abuser's behaviour, there might be quite a limited response. And also there's the issue of safety in court. So many of us may know of Practice Direction 12J, which is about special measures. Now, technically speaking, this only applies in children's proceedings. So when we come to things such as divorce and financial arrangements, it's not always automatic that these safety measures will be put in place. So these are some key areas that we've heard from survivors. And just like with the work into occupation orders, we're supporting some research by Northumbria University, by their law school, to have a look into this and to try and find out what is happening, to develop that evidence base so we can then move forward and try and do something and create change so that when survivors are going through this process, they face much better outcomes. Okay, so the final system and the final stage in the journey. So let's say that B she's gone back to court to get the order to be enforced, and the perpetrator has been told quite clearly that the home must be sold. So perhaps now she even has an order that might have agreed the particular estate agents that are going to do the viewings and the particular conveyancing firm that will carry out the sale. So she's now at the point where she'll be putting the home on the market. And in B's case, we know that this is very, very time, there's a big time focus because she's already in arrears and she does not want the home to be repossessed before she can sell it. So yeah, as I said in this example, she even has a court order which agrees the firms that will be instructing the sale. So now we sort of think, what could go wrong here? Everything is in place that needs to be. But unfortunately, there is a lot of economic abuse that can even take place at this stage. So we hear so many examples at sea of abusers essentially using any tool that they have in their toolbox. So they may sabotage the sale of the home by disrupting viewings. We know that some people will turn up to viewings pretending to be a neighbour, trying to put off prospective buyers. We also know that abusers have also sent friends to go and pretend to have a viewing just so they can get inside the home as a wider pattern of stalking behaviour. They may refuse to agree to offers, saying that the offer isn't high enough, just so that the sale won't go through. And there is some research that was done a little while ago now, but it's the only figure that I've come across. And in that research, the researchers conservatively estimated that 10% of repossessions are as a result of domestic abuse. So we know that abusers' behaviour really does, in a lot of cases, result in the worst case scenario, which is repossession. Now, I've got an image up in the presentation of Stella Eden's book, The Right to Be Me. So Stella, she speaks about her experiences within this book of trying to sell her home. And in fact, I think the last 2/3 of the book is just her talking about the process she went through of trying to sell the home. So for her, for example, the abuser was so aggressive to an estate agent and conveyancing firm that he would be successful in getting them to sack them. So then Stella, who had a court order, who had a particular firm agreed, was then in a position where she'd have to go back to court to get a new firm agreed to do the sale. And so where she already had a buyer lined up, she would be in a position where she would have to tell the buyer, oh, I'm so sorry, it's going to be another 3-4 months. I have to wait till I get another court hearing so we can agree a new firm. And you can imagine just how much that affected the sale. So I really would encourage anyone who wants to learn a bit more about this particular system and these processes and what can happen to read Stella's book, because it's really eye-opening into just how much economic abuse can be exercised by the perpetrator at this stage. And there is a lot of work that can be done in this arena. So we've worked a little bit alongside the Society of Licensed Conveyancers, and we attended a conference of theirs recently. And there's also work to be done in relation to estate agents. So at the moment, there is a lot of work taking place around the regulation of property agents. And that includes professionals such as letting agents and estate agents. And essentially, there is a lot of work being done to try and regulate and ensure that the process of buying and selling a home and even renting is fair. So there's a lot of focus on things such as fees and transparency and being fair to all customers. And we're really keen that this this opportunity is seized to really take into account the issues that survivors face when they're experiencing domestic abuse. So we recently responded to a consultation about the draft code of practice. And just to give you an example, there is a proposed condition clause in this code of practice whereby estate agents would have to mandatorily report any crime to the police. Now, of course, anyone working in the domestic abuse field knows that, you know, any automatic reporting of domestic abuse might not be safe. So there's an opportunity here to really work alongside the sector to make sure that any regulation is done safely and in a way that meets the needs of all survivors. And there will also be mandatory training and CPD and a regulator in place. So we're going to be watching this process really keenly and yeah, working alongside this process as much as we can. Okay, so I really hope that this webinar has given you a good understanding of what a survivor's journey might be where they're a homeowner. And so this comes to the end of Bee's journey, but we really just wanted to summarise and bring all these systems together. Now, I apologise, as you may have noticed before, for some reason, the videos are working within the PowerPoint today. And I was going to play a clip by an expert by experience who works alongside us. But I'll just say that, you know, the key part of what the expert says. So she talks about all the systems that she faced, and she talks about the abuse from the abuser. And she describes that for her, there really was no difference in how the abuse felt. So when she was facing difficulties with the mortgage lender, in court, with being declined legal aid, she speaks about how, you know, that felt no different to her. And all of this secondary abuse was extremely traumatic, and that so much needs to be done in order to make sure that no survivor has to go through that again. And now if we just take a quick look at this, this graphic here. Now this graphic just summarises these systems that we've spoken about today. So we have in the green circle, we have universal services that all survivors, regardless of their housing tenure, will need to be in contact with. So we have professionals such as police, we have refuges, domestic abuse services. So homeowners will likely be in contact with these services as well. And then we have the three specific systems we've spoken about today. So the home ownership, purchase and sale. You know, when this is happening, survivors then have to be in conversation and in contact with conveyancers, estate agents. They might have to speak to the land registry. They may have to speak to regulators. Then there is the mortgage product sphere. So again, even more regulations, even more professionals in different systems to have to negotiate and liaise with. So here you have the banks, the building societies, the ombudsman, the regulators, debt advisors can come into play. And then also there is the family law sphere. So then, you know, they're having to liaise and negotiate with, you know, family solicitors, with barristers, with the legal aid agency, with judges. And I think just looking at this diagram, it really emphasizes and shows just how much work really takes to separate a jointly owned property. And as Natalie really highlighted before, this is on top of everything else that's going on. It's extremely exhausting, and there are so many systems and regulations to battle through. And I just wanted to bring it back to something that Natalie highlighted as well, that this economic instability that can be created when you go through these systems, or when you're jointly linked to the perpetrator through a joint property, it can really undermine economic security. And why this is really so important, not just from a perspective of, you know, poverty or loss of potential, but also from safety, because we know that a lack of access to economic security and resources post-separation are the primary reasons that women return to an abusive partner. So if they can't be safe after separation and economically stable, some of these survivors are being put in a position where they have no choice but to return. And of course, that really undermines their long-term safety. Okay, thank you, Christina.
Thank you, Steph. I think you've really taken us, and Natalie as well, you've really taken us on this journey today. And I think, you know, I'm monitoring the chat and I can see so many people resonating with the length of this journey, the difficulties that you encounter, and how it feels, you know, so similar to so many people. And I think it just shows, you know, how complex this journey is. And when you put up those 4 spheres, we start to understand just how many people you might have to speak to in order to resolve this. And so, we know that, frontline professionals in the domestic abuse sector are working tremendously hard trying to support survivors from that range of 10 years, which Rebecca, alluded to earlier. So not just privately owned housing, but private rented accommodation as well. And we recognise that surviving economic abuse, that professionals have, it's not just housing they're trying to solve, they're also supporting people with their physical safety, with benefits, with access to all forms of support. So at Surviving Economic Abuse, we have a brilliant housing specialist called Louise Jones. And that Louise works specifically in London, although the rest of our housing work is nationwide, but we have a specific project within London where our housing specialist is able to provide support and advice and information to any domestic abuse professional or housing professional or wider professional who is supporting a survivor of economic abuse. And so, within this project, we really aim to just skill up, any professional who's supporting someone around economic abuse, because as this webinar has hopefully highlighted today, this is a really complex area. There's a lot of information to get your head around. And as an organisation, we have been able to focus on this. So if you are a professional today who is, you have particular cases and you do need some support and information, and you are based in the London area, please do consider getting in contact with Surviving Economic Abuse. There's details about how to contact us in the chat function, and we'll also provide some information about our website later on. But there are resources available as well for victim survivors on our website. But in particular, if you need support around privately owned housing or across any tenure, please do contact Surviving Economic Abuse. We can put you through to the housing specialist, Louise, who can hopefully point you in the right direction and signpost you to some information to support that victim survivor. So as I said, we have nearly 30 resources for victim survivors available for free on our website. These can all be downloaded. And we also have some audio versions available to meet different needs. So these range from everything on how to separate your finances, including resources which look specifically at housing and the issues that we've talked about today. So do feel free to signpost victim survivors to the website, take a look yourself, and feel free to share these widely. We also have a set of resources for professionals which we have developed. So these range from everything from a guide for mortgage providers on how to support victim survivors of economic abuse. So if you are here as a mortgage provider today or someone who works in that sphere, we do have a guide out there for you. We also have guides for professionals on a range of areas, including a conversation kit for legal professionals, a guide for bank staff on how to support victim survivors during COVID. And I think it just at this point, we've worked so closely with banks and building societies, and a number of our professional resources are geared up towards supporting those who work in banks and building societies to respond to this. And that's why we do so much work closely with Lloyds Banking Group in order to support victim survivors and ensure that when they do get through, and that is their mortgage lender, that they're met with empathy, understanding, and feel supported on this, what is a very complex and long journey. So I just want to, just before we get into the question and answer session, and thank you so much, we've had lots and lots of questions coming throughout the session today. So we'll get into those in a minute and we'll put those to both Steph and Natalie. I just want to highlight that as part of this webinar series, we have 4 further upcoming webinars. Next week, we'll focus on banking, an area I'm particularly passionate about. So if you've heard some things around banking today and you'd like to hear more about what we've been doing with banks and building societies, please join us next week. We'll also have a webinar sharing the findings of a rapid review we conducted during COVID-19, which looked at the experiences of victim survivors during this year's pandemic. So that's a further webinar. We will also have one on our work with the police and how police can support victim survivors of economic abuse. And we'll also have one looking at the impacts of economic abuse on children. So if you would like to access these webinars, a link will be provided into the chat. You can just visit our website and sign up in the same way you did for this one. But a huge thank you for attending today, and we do hope to see some of you at the next few webinars as well. So if I could just invite the panel back to my screen, and if it's okay, we've got quite a few questions to start off with. So if I could just start off, one of the questions that keeps sort of coming up on the chat is, we've talked a lot about economic abuse today, and economic abuse being a crime or a particular challenge. Is economic abuse a crime? And if not, is there a way of capturing those types of behaviours when reporting to the police?
Yeah, I'll come in on this one, but Christina, if you want to interject, please do so. So economic abuse can be a crime, but it depends. So as some of you may know, there is a relatively new criminal offence of coercive and controlling behaviour. And that includes patterns of behaviour, which may include economic abuse within it. Now, so if you are to report a pattern of coercive controlling behaviour to the police, they may be able to pursue that as a crime. However, there are some caveats there. So for example, if the abuse you're experiencing is post-separation and you're no longer what's known as personally connected to the abuser, so if you don't live together and you're separated, it no longer counts as coercive control towards the offence. So you might find yourself in a grey area where you are experiencing economic abuse, but it might not technically fall under that criminal offence. And some of the work that C is doing in relation to the domestic abuse bill is we're really trying to push for an amendment to extend that offence of coercive control and behaviour to cover post-separation abuse, so that survivors don't fall through the gaps in that way. And of course, you know, there might be other offences that apply, you know, fraud-based offences, criminal damage, depending on what's taking place. But we know that it's not always a criminal offence.
Thank you so much. And just another question that's come in terms of looking at the legal aid issue, which we talked about so much. If someone, you talked about how certain legal aid can almost act as a loan and kind of be placed against the property until that property is then sold. Is there particular terminology to use to access that? Is there a particular way to access that with the legal aid agency, or is that a decision that they make?
Yeah, so this is something known as the statutory charge, and it is the legal aid agency's decision to make. And the statutory charge isn't available to you if you are over that maximum threshold. Usually it's for people who, yeah, they are eligible to some extent, and it can be secured against the property. So they will usually still have to pass the legal aid means test to be able to access that. But yeah, I'd encourage you to speak to a family law solicitor who operates with legal aid, and they'll be able to advise much further on that.
Brilliant, thank you. And it might be a bit of a question that maybe doesn't have an answer, but for victim survivors who you do the legal aid assessment and you find that they're not eligible for legal aid, is there any other organisations or anything we're aware of that can provide any funding or support for victim survivors, or any pro bono legal representation?
Yeah, I mean, there are options, but it's a bit of a postcode lottery. So, you know, there is the Flows service run by Rights of Women in partnership with other organisations, which is finding legal options for women survivors. So if you contact them, they'll be best placed to point you in the right direction. And it really depends on the capacity of your local law firms, if they're able to offer pro bono support. Some firms are sometimes able to come to an agreement whereby when you get your settlement, then they will take their fee. But of course, it just depends on the law firm and the resources they have. And in fact, that recent judicial review, the judgment by the judge, the legal aid agency had asserted that they felt that this person didn't need legal aid because they should be able to access one of those routes. And actually the judge disagreed and said that while some people may be able to access those things, some people won't be so lucky. So yes, definitely do have a look at these other avenues, but do be aware that for some people, they just won't be available, and it might just depend on the resources in their area.
Brilliant, thank you. And we've got a couple of questions coming in, I think drawing on some of the things that you spoke about, Natalie. And so someone's asked here, can economic abuse be raised in a final hearing, or is that just a no-go?
That really depends on what's happened before in the case and what sort of case it is, and kind of the nature of what happened. That's really a how long is a piece of string kind of question. It really just depends. If it's a child arrangements case, you know, that's something that we specialise in, and that's our focus at #the court said, and at Survivor Family Network as well, which is where you'll find our court confidence course. The course will guide you through a child arrangements case quite reliably. It does really prepare you for all those kind of things, but that type of question is a really difficult one to answer. I would personally be saying, my instinct is to say I wouldn't at a final hearing, but it really does depend on what the case is, what's happened, and you know what it means. But you're welcome to email the details to me, and I can answer that question privately after having a little bit more background.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is where it can get difficult, and when we speak to survivors, you know, they can say different things, because some survivors speak about being told just to not mention domestic abuse at all during their proceedings, so they're actually advised by their lawyers just to not bring it up because it will lead to unfavourable outcomes for them. So yeah, this is just something where it's really important to get legal advice. And it's probably one of the reasons why, you know, we see so many people who are litigants in person getting into all those different forms of debt, just trying to access advice to answer questions like this. Because, for example, they know that there's economic abuse and they feel that it might be relevant or it should be relevant to proceedings, but they don't know how to go about sharing that, particularly if in a hearing they're told that it's not relevant. It can be quite confusing following those procedures and knowing when and how to bring it up.
The issue for me was the final hearing. Really, you need to know sort of what's gone on before, whether something is right to bring up at a final hearing, because you know you could potentially damage a case. So I didn't, you know, I think it's best that, you know, I think be very careful about how economic abuse is raised because of the way it is received currently in court, and it feels very unethical to say that out loud. Because you should be able to raise it, and it should be able to be talked about. However, with the system the way it is at the moment and all the changes that have got to be made in there that haven't yet been implemented, sometimes it's a judgment call about these things. But you're welcome to email me, and I'm going to put my email address and all the other various bits and bobs that I've got online in the chat as well.
Yeah. And so
Thank you so much.
I'll just go back to the research by Northumbria University, because one of the topics they're looking into is this issue of raising economic abuse or conduct within financial proceedings. So do watch this space because it will be quite interesting to see what they find.
Lovely, thank you. And thank you, Natalie. I think a lot of people are really interested in the work that you are doing and would love to be in contact with you. So please do pop those details in the chat. And just following on, so lots of people were delighted to see the result of the legal aid challenge in the High Court. And we've just got a question here on how long does a judgment like that, how long before we start to see that take effect and start to see the legal aid agency, you know, rule in that direction on cases?
That's a very difficult question to answer. Yeah, I'm really not sure how that would filter through or when. You know, certainly at the moment it could be that practice remains the same for now, because of course, you know, those arguments about a survivor being seen to be able to meet their legal advice needs elsewhere could still be made. And in fact, if you read the whole judgment, and the judge actually even says, you know, they've made this particular ruling, but it does go back to the legal aid agency because they will still need to determine, do they think in this particular case that this particular survivor will actually still be able to access the the resources otherwise that they need. So yeah, it might be that, you know, more cases are still rejected, but perhaps there's an increase in lawyers appealing them as a result of this ruling. It's really, really difficult to know at this stage.
Lovely, thank you. Yeah, I think it's a tricky one. It's just happened last week, so I think, yeah, keep your eyes very closely peeled and let's see how it takes shape, and hopefully it's in a positive direction. So we've just got a couple other questions here. So how can a victim survivor convince the mortgage lender to remove the abuser from the joint mortgage when they're no longer paying it? Is it a case of just convincing the mortgage lender, or is there more to it than that?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's a lot more to it than that. And this is where we can see the importance again of the family court arena. And in fact, one thing that's quite, was surprising when I first encountered it is that, the survivor can spend years in court, get this order that both parties have agreed to with a judge that the abuser will remove themselves from the mortgage and they will come off it. But then when they go to do it practically, the abuser refuses. And again, it's the onus is on the survivor to go back to court to try and get the order enforced, or to perhaps, in some extreme cases, ask for the judge to sign the paperwork on their behalf. But of course, this is a really long process. In the meantime, they might be in arrears. It's more stress, more paperwork, more time in court with the abuser that they have to face. And then even if they do find that, they have the agreement of the abuser, or say a court has superseded that, they might then take it to the mortgage lender, and the mortgage lender says, well, we're sorry, but you just can't afford the mortgage on your own. We can't offer you your own product. And that can even be for survivors who've been paying the mortgage by themselves for a really long period of time. So yeah, this is a really difficult area, and mortgage affordability is something that we're looking at in quite close detail at the moment, because there are some exceptions that have been put in place to address the needs of mortgage prisoners, which some of you may have heard of. And we're trying to explore at the moment whether they may apply to survivors as well.
Thank you. Yeah, and just on that point, someone's just asked that if when there is a particular, well, kind of taking it back to the legal aid point, really. So you're finally in the courtroom, you finally got to court, and then you're in a financial proceedings case, and someone's asking, why is there the lack of willingness for solicitors, barristers, the legal system to acknowledge when abusers conceal their income? So I think, Natalie, you talked about abusers perhaps making themselves self-employed in order to lower a child maintenance payment. And so people are just asking in general, why is there this lack of interest in knowing more about the abuser's financial situation and the economic abuse? What drives that? Where do we think that comes from?
I personally think that comes from a wider perception, actually, about people who allege abuse, victims. I think that we're always ignored, really. And if you're alleging abuse in court, you will see it minimized everywhere. There's even cases where an abuser has admitted it in the courtroom in front of the judge, and it just gets excused. And I think it is I don't think they're joining the dots. I don't think that they're actually realizing how serious it is, how bad the impacts are, and how long these impacts last for. And there's this thing about minimizing it all, because the central premise of the family court is that the child will have contact with both parents. So that puts Article 8 rights, your right to family life, right at the top. Okay, now anything that gets in the way of that, like domestic abuse or other pesky subjects, is a problem for the court, because it makes them very difficult to actually, they can't really remove those rights. They can't, because they've placed the Article 8 rights so high, the right to family life, that it sort of overrides everything else. So what they're not doing is they're not prioritising the children, and they're not prioritising the victims, and they're not looking at their rights not to be subject to inhumane and degrading treatment, which is actually a right that supersedes the right to family life. So the priorities are all kind of twisted, they're back to front. And I think that's personally what I think is responsible for this being minimized in every possible area. They don't want to hear about the problems because it doesn't fit with what their goals are. It doesn't fit with the narrative.
Thank you so much. And just on that point, as a further point, we've had a couple questions which draw on the same issue, that what happens when, you know, you're in these legal proceedings, as you just said, Natalie, and then the person who is the abuser is actually a legal professional themselves. Have we seen examples of that? And, you know, how does that work? We've, you know, someone said in the chat, it leads to, you know, a judge not wanting to acknowledge that this is happening within their own system. And how does it impact when someone's abuser is a legal professional? Does that produce additional challenges?
Yeah, it's the short answer. It really will produce a challenge because they will know their way around, you know. So they'll be able to navigate things with a lot more ease than another victim, because it does feel like the doors are sort of closed to us if we don't know this sort of rather extensive rule book. So, excuse me, sorry. So, yeah, one of the problems I have actually seen is what happens when the victim is a professional, such as a judge or a CAFCAS officer or a social worker or other legal professional. And they often say the same thing to me when the boot's been on sort of the other foot, if you like, and they're going in through it in their own case. And they will always say to me, I knew it was bad in there, but I didn't realise how bad until it happened to me. And it seems there is not very much protection for anyone in there, no matter what your education or standing or professional role. I you know, having helped judges and solicitors and CAFCAS officers through my programme over the summer, it was a great leveller. There's something very drastically wrong when that happens in a system like this, where the people that even know their way around it struggle immensely as well, you know. So there's two sides to that.
Absolutely. And so at C we have a legal and policy advisor, and one of the aspects she's looking into is abuse by legal professionals, because it does, as Natalie said, just open up avenues. You know, it's almost like the abuser has more tools in their toolbook because they know the system so well. So that is yeah, one of the sort of small areas that we are looking into. And I also wanted to go back as well about you know, what you were asking about the court's appetite. And because I think with these things we have to think about the context of the laws that are governing these procedures and why and when they were introduced, because a lot of financial arrangements is governed by the Matrimonial Causes Act and, you know, associated legislation, and I think that's from 1973. And so in 1973 that was incredibly progressive, and it gave women so many rights that they didn't have previously for the first time. So that was really fantastic. But also back in 1973, we didn't really understand economic abuse or coercive control. But there were things put in place within court proceedings to ensure that, you know, they weren't drawn out in the case that someone said, oh, well, he did this thing wrong, or she did that, or they cheated. So there would be a lot of lengthy disputes over how assets are dealt with based on minor things. And so when you take into account that context, that maybe explains a little bit of why we are where we are today. But I'm really interested in the outcome of the research by Northumbria University when they do look into this, because it really should shine a light on what is going on.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. And one of the last questions we'll just ask for today in terms of time. So you've talked a lot today about the barriers that people face when fleeing abuse and when they live in privately owned accommodation. One of those being potentially not being eligible for social housing if they own their own home and if they can't afford private rent. Have we seen any cases where victim survivors have been able to access their own housing or access housing through the council despite owning their own home? Because this is a particular challenge for those working on the front line.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for asking this question, whoever asked, because it's a really common misconception. Yes, you are still eligible for housing, but it all depends on how that housing is going to be paid for. So, you know, as long as you meet the immigration conditions and all of those requirements, if you're a survivor of domestic abuse and you're fleeing abuse, then a homelessness application should be accepted for you by the local authority, or you should be able to go to a refuge, because it's not safe for you to live in your current accommodation, and therefore from a legal standpoint you're homeless. But the issue really comes in where survivors are trying to keep paying the mortgage, but then they need to pay the rent of either their temporary accommodation or refuge. And particularly refuge accommodation is, you know, very expensive, because you're also paying for some of the costs of the staffing and support you get there. And, you know, if you're not eligible for housing benefit because of your income, but actually most of your income is going on paying the mortgage, you're left in a bit of a gap in the middle there. And so people are sort of often in that decision of, okay, so do I leave my job and allow my home to be repossessed, but access this refuge and get housing benefit? And some people can, because the abuser will continue to pay the mortgage and that will be okay for them. But some people are in that really difficult situation where they're having to decide what to do. But yeah, absolutely. Just because you're a homeowner does not mean that you can't access those things. It just means that finances are going to be a bit more, difficult to figure out.
Absolutely. And if you are a frontline professional and you are supporting a case where the local authority are pushing back, or it's not been seen as priority, or they're not following what Steph just said, please do get in contact with us, and we might be able to signpost you to some particular information around that. And if you're in London, our housing specialist Louise would be able to provide some specific information around that.
Yeah, I know it's 4 o'clock, so we're about to end, but just to mention, so Louise and her service within London, a few cases she has found is that people have been accepted as homeless, but then they're put on the lowest band for housing, and realistically they're not going to be offered anywhere for many years to come. And Louise has successfully helped the caseworkers to push back on that and get the survivor put in priority banding again. So that's exactly the sort of assistance she can provide to help with that sort of situation.
Thanks so much, Steph. So please do get in touch. I'm aware we've hit 4 o'clock. Thank you so much for everyone's patience, and a big thank you to our speakers today, Natalie, Steph, and of course Rebecca from Standing Together, who's had to leave us. I think we can all agree it's been a really inspiring discussion. There's a lot of work still to do, but I think we've got some real forces behind that work. So thank you so much for everyone for joining. The recording will be available and sent to you on Friday. Any questions we haven't been able to answer, we will answer, and hope to release a short blog post around that. And if you have any particular questions for surviving economic abuse, please do get in touch via our website, and we look forward to hearing from you. And we hope to see you at our next webinars. Take care, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Natalie.